Hello, everybody. So, I do sometimes talk about mysteries, that sort of thing. And today I wanted to have a talk about the Neanderthals and also how it relates to some of the established myths and legends over the years. So, we know that there's a lot of myths and legends that exist all over the place, and people say, well, that's all just made up. It's just because people went and told their stories and then someone else took it on. We also know that humanity started off with two people. And whether they and there is, and I have to accept that there is a religious view that they were created by God or spiritual being, and it's more than one religion that says that. And there's also the view that it was just natural evolution and it came from apes or monkeys or some ape-like being. Um, and I guess for me, I think there's evidence both ways, and there's also evidence against them both ways. So I wanted to sort of deal with some of that, and I really think that the Neanderthals are a bit of a key. So the first thing to note is that Neanderthals were not called Neanderthals at the time. So as for what we called them, um, there's a few different schools of thought, but we do actually have names for them. And one of the persistent names comes from the Sumerians, which were of course focused around what is today known as Iraq, and that they called them the Adamu, which meant the red-headed people. And the funny thing is, and people don't realize this, a lot of people think, well, there's always been white people and black people. That's not true. It used to be everyone was black, but before we had white skin, we had red hair. So red hair was the first variant. So we started off, everybody had black hair, brown eyes, and dark skin, or what we call black skin, but it's not technically black. It's never been actually black, but it's dark brown. And so dark brown skin, brown eyes, and black hair was actually black hair. But the first variant was the red hair. Now, the red hair, I mean, we can't tell on fossils, we can't very often tell what color hair that they had, but certainly based on the Sumerian view, um, Adamu was red hair. And of course, that does tie in with Adam and Eve. And perhaps it's a bit of a different story, but essentially, Adam and Eve is widely believed to be a story actually of the Eve of the Adamu, the Eve of the red-headed people, which today we call Neanderthals. So now according to the Sumerians, began about 130,000 years ago, and that actually lines up reasonably well with the fossil record. That's when they started. Now, humans, what we call Homo sapiens, were actually older than that, more like 400,000 years ago. So we're the older species, and usually when you're the older species, you get killed off by the younger one. Well, not always, because sometimes the new species is weaker, or and that's the problem. So when top species of humans grew up in idyllic conditions, such as in islands where there were no natural predators, they tended to become short and weak, and we call them pygmies. Now, there's a number of us, human species that were like that. Australopithecus, I can't remember the name of it. But there were a number of them, and they coexisted with us, and we didn't know about them because they were off in little islands in what's today Indonesia and various other places. We didn't know that they existed. We didn't have anything to do with them. If we didn't know about them, we would have killed them because, well, maybe we wouldn't have cared. So we today call them pygmies, but they didn't call them pygmies 100,000 years ago. They gave them another name, and that name was almost certainly dwarf. Now, it may not have been dwarf because dwarf is also a name. There is a condition known as dwarfism, and there's another condition known as gigantism. So essentially, if you're shorter than about 4'6", which is what's that, about 130, 135 centimeters, if you're any shorter than that as a fully grown adult, you're considered to be a dwarf. But people don't call them dwarfs anymore. They call them little people because apparently, for some reason, I do not understand why calling someone a dwarf is an insult if that's factually what you are. But we're not meant to call them that, so we call them midgets. Sorry, not even call them midgets. My apologies. We call them little people. But yet, if you're over 6'6", which is about, what's that, about 195 centimeters, 200 centimeters, if you're taller than about 2 meters tall, you can be called a giant, and that's not insulting. So why is giant okay and dwarf isn't? They're both factual descriptions. And certainly in ancient times, like, and I'm not talking about 500 years ago or even 2,000 years ago, I'm talking about 100,000 years ago, humans would definitely still exist. Anyone over 2 meters would have been called a giant, and anyone shorter, so 6'6", anyone shorter than 4'6", so 135 centimeters round about, would have been called a dwarf. Now, whether they stuck to those strict rules, they probably didn't. They probably didn't measure it too much. But we would have called that would have been ordinary humans. But there were certainly races of dwarves or races of little people that we describe today historically as pygmies. And these existed, these were species of humans, these existed on islands, and they would have come about every so often. Whole communities where everybody's short. And they grew up in short in islands mainly where there was idyllic conditions and no real major predators, and they didn't need to be tall, so over the generations they got shorter. Now, the opposite also happened. In harsh environments, people grew bigger and taller. Now, one such harsh environment was in what is today Siberia. So, I suppose you can call it Eastern Russia. And in this area, and we don't know quite the range of them, some people just say Russia, some people say Eastern Europe, but we call them today Denisovans. Now, these people, there's no full skeleton, so we don't know exactly how tall they were. But based on the fractions, the fragment of the skeleton, they could have been as tall as 9 feet tall. Now, nobody in recorded history has been 9 foot tall. The tallest is about 8'8", and these people didn't live very long. They had gigantism. So if you can imagine a species where the whole set of them were 9 feet tall, they would be pretty tall. And that would be around about 280 centimeters. And also, there's a chance that they were taller than that. They could have been, based on some descriptions of the skeleton fragments, could have been as much as twice that tall, could have been up to 540 centimeters or 18 feet. So, even if it's 9 feet, and even if it wasn't 9 feet, even if it was just 7 feet, these would have been a race of giants, and we would have called them giants. Now, they're still humans, right? So, we can explain the giants, we can explain the dwarfs. Now, we definitely didn't call them Denisovans, and I can tell you why, because they're from the Denisovan cave, which is named after a guy called Dennis, who lived in the 18th century. Now, these guys were extinct by 30,000 years ago, so definitely weren't called Denisovans. We can call them Denisovans now because that's what we call them, but they would have been called giants. Would we have given them other names? I don't think so. I think we would have just called them giants. And that's the thing, there's been descriptions in ancient Greece of different types of giants. Maybe that's just one type of giant. And there's also evidence that the Denisovans, who I'm just going to call the giants, existed all around the world. And they interacted with us, with Homo sapiens and with Neanderthals. Now, don't think there were just three races, three species of humans at the same time. There were more than three, because there were the pygmies as well, which I'm going to call the dwarfs. Now, what did we call Neanderthals? Now, certainly we called them Adamu, the red-headed people, but that's just what the Sumerians called them. What did other people call them? So we know that the Neanderthals actually were smarter than us. The Denisovans may not have been. They're just tall and they needed to be they needed to be strong enough to fight against, crippling cold. You know how cold it is in Siberia and it's frozen over and there wasn't supposed to be any people there, but apparently there were. They had to be fighting, some really tough predators plus tough natural environments. Now the Neanderthals didn't have to do that, but there's evidence that they fought against cave bears and cave lions by themselves. And now us Homo sapiens, we just ran away from them, but they were strong. They were shorter than us, but they were stronger than us, and they were smarter than us. So these guys were just tough creatures. And now, according to the Sumerians, and I use this, and there's some claims that they focused around Germany and where we get Neanderthal the name from. So because that's where the last remnants of them were, about 13,000 years ago. So around about the time of the last cataclysm. And in fact, the last cataclysm, the Great Flood, and then some people say, oh, that wasn't really the Great Flood, it was this volcanic eruption. Whatever it was, doesn't really matter. Maybe the volcanic eruption caused the Great Flood, and then there's the meteors that came down. Whatever that was, that wiped out most of the Neanderthals. And the last remnants were in the Neanderthal Valley in modern day Germany. But it wasn't called that 13,000 years ago. What was it called? Probably didn't. I don't know what it was called. We've lost the records of what it might have been called. And the idea that they were focused in this tiny area in Germany is silly. Wasn't. And according to the Sumerians, they went south from the base in Iraq, or what was modern day Iraq, and they went down to further south and then disappeared. And they don't know where they went. Now, most likely they went all the way down to Madagascar or South Africa. They skipped over to Madagascar. And now I know some people say, oh no, but India wasn't connected to Africa at the time. That was a million years ago. Maybe they swam to India, or maybe India actually was connected and we've got our years wrong with that for when they split off. But either way, if you look at the Hindu religion and the names of things and the description of the people, it seems as if the Hindu religion was actually the Neanderthal religion, and that the original Hindus were Neanderthals. And they called themselves, of course, the Aryas. So they called themselves the Aryas. So Adamu become Arya, both have an A and then another A, and it's quite possible that they were called the Adamu, meaning redhead, by the Sumerians, and then called themselves the Aryans. So that's the name they gave themselves when they developed their own language and their own religion, and called their own religion Hinduism. Now, I can go on to why Hinduism is actually different to that. But essentially, the Hinduism is our version of it. It's the Homo sapien or the human version of the Neanderthal religion. It's not the same religion, but it's just so after the Neanderthals, we killed them. And this is, and I can go into this again. About 6,000 years ago, we created two new religions, those being Judaism and Hinduism. Both of these were based on the Neanderthal religion. And again, they call themselves Aryans. They didn't call themselves Adamu. Adamu was the name that we called them. But they called themselves the Aryans. And these are the polite names. There were some other nastier names that we call them as well. And I can get into that in a minute. But so, of course, we defeated them with the help of the giants. And the giants were wiped out in that. So the giants died out about 30,000 years ago. We still fought against the Neanderthals for another 17,000 years before we defeated them. Now, and we had some help from meteors, we had some help from possibly a volcano, great flood, all that sort of thing. But however it was, we defeated them. There's no way we could have defeated them on our own. And I don't think realistically that natural disaster would have been enough. We needed those giants to help us. And maybe there were still giants going around a bit later than that, just not very many of them. Um, and of course, the Slavic people of Eastern Europe and parts of Asia were actually, or still are, descended from the Denisovans. They have Denisovan DNA in them in large numbers. So they are the same people, but just mostly human. And there's bits of Neanderthal DNA in most other people, except for people in southern Africa, or southern two-thirds of Africa, what we call sub-Saharan Africa, although Africans don't call it that. just want to say. So if you're an African listening to that, you're saying, what's sub-Saharan? If you're not African, you probably understand what that means. But if you are African, I'll say Southern Africa, but then I don't want to say South Africa because that refers to just one country. It's anywhere south of the Sahara Desert. So those people, many of them are pure Homo sapiens, which suggests that the Neanderthals never really defeated us because that would have been our focus. So we had this sort of this area in northern Africa, which was disputed territory, and that's where you had Neanderthals and Homo sapiens fighting. Europe was Neanderthal country. The southern two-thirds of Africa was Homo sapiens territory. And most of Eastern Europe and Asia was Denisovan territory or giant territory. And then, of course, you had other parts of the world which had a lot of pygmies or dwarves living there. So you kind of had four areas. You had dwarf lands, you had giant lands, you had human lands, and you had Neanderthal lands. four areas. That's interesting, isn't it? And you had the disputed area was Northern Africa. So, and isn't that funny? Because that's the area where all these religions started. That's where Judaism started. That's where, well, Hinduism was India, but it's sort of disputed land. It's curious, isn't it? Anyway, so what happened? How did the Neanderthals die? And also, what do we call them? So, if you look at some ancient history and you look at, yeah, there's dragons. That's one thing that's all around the world. A lot of people associate that with dinosaurs. So dragons, I mean, there's two schools of thought, well, a few schools of thought. One school of thought is that dragons were only ever mythical beings. They were gods, and there's evidence that they were worshipped as gods, and they weren't real. Same as like if you look at fairies, there's no real evidence that fairies were ever considered to be real physical beings, unless you want to consider butterflies or fireflies. And same as elves, never considered to be a real being, a real physical being, a metaphysical. Were dragons the same, or were they physical beings that we today call dinosaurs? Were they? Did they exist with humans? Well, dinosaurs sort of still do. I mean, crocodiles are a type of dinosaur. They still exist. But are we talking about dinosaurs? Did dinosaurs look as we think they look? Blah 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 blah. Maybe dinosaurs actually did breathe fire? We can't be certain. Um, and and so forth. Or just because there's no skeletal records, no fossil record, doesn't mean that they weren't there at the same time as us. Because we know that fossils are only created if you die in a certain way. So as long as the dragons or dinosaurs, pretty confident they're the same thing. If they, as long as they didn't die in a tar pit or something like that, there will be no evidence of them. As long as they're sensible enough not to die in that way, they're fine. So dragons, dinosaurs, probably the same thing, probably did coexist at least a little bit with humans. And there's evidence that, it's the thing, there's persistent evidence that dragons came to Earth in what we today call Scandinavia, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark. It's a bit of Iceland or Greenland, maybe, depends on your definition of Scandinavia. And then they left and went to China. And so Chinese say that they brought the dragons in, but and the Vikings, they stopped believing in dragons. They stopped following them. They got rid of the dragons. One group said they got rid of the dragons. Another group said they brought them in. So there's consistency. There's consistency. There's Native Americans saying they defeated dragons. There's all sorts of groups that talk about what happened, and it seems as if, oh, they started in Scandinavia, went to China. Of course, Chinese people and a lot of Asian people say that the dragons still exist. Are they the same dragons? Maybe not, but so they're either gods, were never a physical being. That's option one. Number two is that they did coexist with us. We've now defeated them, and they just don't have fossils. And number three, which a lot of people believe, is that they were dinosaurs and we just misunderstood fossils. Just looked at fossils and just guessed. Don't think that's very likely, but you never know. There's another thing is that the medieval period, a lot of people, historical say, oh, they only lasted 500 years. And it's really confusing because if you look at how the medieval period is described, and they say, oh, for the past 10,000 years, they say, oh, it's only 500 years. Where'd 10,000 years come from? But then we don't really have any record beyond 6,000 years ago. So they could well have been medieval. Let's say they were medieval 20,000 years ago, then stopped being medieval because we're fighting for survival, then went back to medieval. And I think that there's some plausibility that the medieval period was actually more than 100,000 years. I mean, the Sumerians, we're told, oh, they're only 10,000 years or 8,000 years. But then the Sumerians themselves said, no, we were 500,000 years. 500,000, not 50,000, not 5,000, 500,000. And if you look at the human history, humans were existing 500,000 years ago. And so you go, well, hang on. So the Sumerians were around for 500,000 years and they weren't medieval to start with, but they, you know, brought into this. Then we sort of go into, okay, could we have had a medieval period, then had a big disaster, great flood, volcanic activity, meteors flying, that destroyed everything, went back into our shell, and then came back into the medieval period? Yes, we could have. So, with that in mind, I'm going to say the medieval period was, let's say, at least 30,000 years. And it may not have been in a row, there might have been gaps where they weren't, but I'm going to say at least 30,000 years. And I'm going to say that the medieval period included our fight against Neanderthals and the involvement of the Denisovans. And now, if you have that in mind, if you look at the medieval period, what were they talking about coexisted with humans? They said, well, there were dwarfs, there were giants. Okay, that's just short people and tall people. They also said there were trolls. Now, the trolls didn't live with us. They lived under bridges and all that sort of stuff. They existed. What were trolls? And then you have, well, there were goblins and orcs. But they didn't live with us. They lived in a different area. Now, what were goblins, orcs, and trolls really? Well, we didn't want to refer, we had no respect at all for Neanderthals. We hated them. They were threatening us. Now, whether they were coming from India when it crash landed into Asia, and India said, this is the thing, according to Indian history, which nobody accepts other than Indians, Aryans, which is what they call themselves, took over most of Europe and most of Asia, and they called that land the Aryas. Now, if this was the Neanderthal conquest, and it lines up with the Neanderthal conquest, that's a pretty nasty thing. And if that's the case, if that really happened, so they crashed landed. So when India crashed into Asia, so it was because we know that it started in Australia and then it floated up to Africa and then it disconnected at some point and floated up to Asia and then crashed there, formed the Himalayas, and then soon after that, all of them invaded everywhere and they were technologically superior, all that sort of stuff. Well, that lines up with Neanderthals, what we now know of Neanderthals. They were strong, they were powerful, they were living in isolation in this tough environment. I'm going to say that tough environment was India. Not a peaceful little island, but a tough island. That no, they didn't become big like the Denisovans did, but they became smart because they knew they had to fight against those really strong Sumerians who were really, really powerful, lots more of them than they were, and they knew they were on this island called India, or the Indian subcontinent, and they knew at some point in the future they would have to fight against the Sumerians. And so when they landed, they went out and they took over. No, it wasn't traditional Sumerian land, but these were lands that they conquered so they could build up an empire to fight against the Sumerians. And this would have happened 100,000 years ago. So, floating for 30,000 years, building up their technology, building up their strength, building up their skills for that fight, and then they lost. Ultimately, the Neanderthals lost because we won. So we were the Sumerians. So Sumerians doesn't really refer to one country. Sumer was the name for the world. It was basically another word for humans, although Shinar was the name for the humans that were us, our kind of human. So Shinar meant the black-headed, whilst Adamu meant the red-headed, so Neanderthals. So if you weren't using that Sumerian terminology, what would you have used today? And I think you would have called them goblins or orcs or perhaps trolls, depending on how big they were, because they would have varied in size. So we know that orcs are about the same size as us, goblins a bit shorter, and trolls a bit bigger. Depends on how you look at trolls as to whether they were 7 foot tall, 10 foot tall. Some people say 50. But let's say that trolls were the taller ones, orcs were the average height, and goblins were the short. And they were all Neanderthals. And that's what we called them because we wanted to give them a bad name so that we would hate them. So we had this war, and if you look at the Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings wasn't a fiction. The Lord of the Rings was based on mythology. So it was based on what people believed to be true. So all those orcs were actually Neanderthals. And they don't mention goblins, or they do in bits of it, but then they forget about it. If you look at the movie, there's no mention of goblins. Original scripts or original drafts of the books did suggest goblins. But anyway, so goblin, orc, troll, all the same species, but just different sizes. And these were the ones we're at war with. And these were originally Indians. So we defeated them. We won. Now, again, it's a bit of a mystery how we won, and I don't have all the answers for that. But essentially, I know, and we can look at biblical accounts or Jewish accounts, and they talk about the Nephilim. coming to help them. Now, the Nephilim seems to me like giants. Now, some people say they're fallen angels, but maybe not. Maybe they were just giants. And the giants, of course, came from Siberia. And Siberia at that stage would have been connected to China. And we know that humans lived in China. And the Chinese weren't really part of the Sumerian Empire, they were separate. So they could have formed an alliance with the Sumerians and said, hey, we don't want to fight against this terrible horde of Neanderthals or Aryans or Adamu or orcs, if we call them orcs. So we're going to get these giants come in and help you. And of course, the Chinese talk about giants. Everyone talks about giants. All around the world, they talk about giants. Same with dragons. It's a universal concept. There were giants. And they're extinct. Now, they came along, they fought, and they died. And they thinned the numbers of the Neanderthals. Now, the Denisovans or giants would have been stronger, but smaller in number, and they might not have been as smart. So they would have needed our help to get there. Of course, we weren't as smart as the Neanderthals either. So with their help, we managed to thin the numbers enough to win. Now, there's been talk about different human bottlenecks. Now, that would have been in the Middle East only, not worldwide. Now, after we defeated the Neanderthals, this is a funny thing. So we defeated the Neanderthals, but there were still a few left. And when we had the last cataclysm, about 11,400 years ago, Great Flood, meteors, volcano, all that sort of thing, what we had happen after that is that white people came about. There were no white people before that. Yes, there was red hair. Yes, there were blue eyes. There were even green eyes. So red hair was first, then blue eyes, then green eyes. Then we had white skin. Where did white skin come from? Some people say, and this is a funny thing, I find this absolutely astounding, but they reckon that white skin emerged from lactose intolerance. So you drink milk, your melanin disappears, you turn white. Really? Does that mean to say that everybody in Africa don't drink milk? Or nobody in Africa drinks milk? I don't believe that. I mean, I'd be absolutely shocked. And if they are drinking milk, how long does it take before you turn white? Is that what vitiligo comes? It's a rubbish theory. Now, most people think logically they go, oh well, white people are in Europe, so must come from being colder. But that's actually not what the theory says. No established theory suggests that white people came from being colder, because we had black people in colder climates in Europe for thousands of years. So it clearly didn't come from that. Now, a cataclysm shouldn't cause it either. But what I think probably did cause it is a weapon. Now, just imagine we've advanced so far because we're fighting this war with the Neanderthals. We have to advance, and we're firing rockets to stop these meteors. We're trying to stop all these natural disasters. We know they happen in once every 25,000 years or thereabouts. We've established a technology to fight them, and it didn't work. But let's say the fallout. Now, I don't know what kind of weapon it was. It wouldn't have been nuclear. It would have been something that's different to nuclear weapons. Not necessarily weaker, not necessarily stronger, just different. And the fallout of that would have attacked our DNA, attacked the colour of our skin. And for people in that fallout area, and we know that the meteors were focused around um, what is well Atlantis, I'll say, which was probably the last holdout of the Neanderthal Empire and Mauritania today. And we know that's where the meteors were focused, and that's where people say, "Oh, well, they killed them all." That was where they were based. We weren't based there. That was where they were. That was their last holdout. So we'd already defeated them, but they had a base there in what we now call Mauritania. And I think that's why we're trying to hide the existence of Atlantis there, because we don't want people to know. Like, it's quite scary to think that we were faced against a superior human species and we won. That we don't like to think that. We like to think this is the most advanced that humans have ever been. Let alone that there was another human species that we defeated somehow and got lucky in a lot of ways and had to get help from the giants who sacrificed their own species for it. So yeah, but that fallout probably caused the whiteness of skin in that area because that was nearby to where it was. And the fallout zone would have been North Africa, Europe, most of Europe and North Africa. So there's people with lighter skin there. And that's where your melanin deficiency comes from. So effectively, melanin deficiency is a medical condition. So we should naturally all have dark skin. Where humans are meant to have dark skin. So if you don't have dark skin, it's not your fault. There's also nothing to be proud of. It's just this is the result of probably the fallout from the last cataclysm and our attempts to stop it, which failed. Cataclysm still came, and um, and whatever that weapon was, which was probably fired by the Neanderthals. Now maybe the Neanderthals did it not to save themselves, but to hurt us in a last attempt to hurt us, make our, maybe they thought that they'd kill us. And then the thing is also after that, we know that racism started with black against white. And why would we be racist against our own people? This is our own species. Because after that cataclysm, we went around the world trying to find those holdouts. And there was actually a holdout of Neanderthals in the Neanderthal Valley in Germany. And they were the last ones. And we didn't really find them until quite a lot later. So we would have gone around the world. Oh, we didn't have the technology. Of course, we had the technology. We were going around the world. And you went everywhere and killed off everybody that wasn't us. And don't seem to have got to Australia, but they went to all these other places and wiped them out. And of course, we had the wiping out of the different pygmy creatures, different pygmy races, and everybody that wasn't us. And after that, we felt bad about it, so bad that we formed those two new religions: Hinduism, which was in the area, the physical area where the Neanderthals lived, and that was their base, which was India, today India. Then Arya, we even call it Bharat. That's what they call it in the Indian language, in Hindus, and which is the name that it was then. And they call it Hinduism and pretended essentially that we are Neanderthals. And the difference is between that one and the Jewish religion. If you look at the Jewish religion, they are not pretending that they're Neanderthals, but they're saying we are equal with the Neanderthals. And they wanted an end to the racism. So Judaism is specifically aimed to be an anti-racist um, religion. And I know a lot of people say, but they're racist. It was aimed to be anti-racist, and it was aimed to be in honour of the Neanderthal religion. So you've got one in honour of the Neanderthal religion that also adopted a lot of Sumerian beliefs that sort of improved them to be less racist, to be more understanding. And then on the other hand, you've got the Hinduism one, which I believe is the very close to the original Neanderthal religion. And these two are what you might call manufactured religions. So the religions before that we had were more natural, more genuine religions that we actually believe. But these two new religions sprung up to prevent us from ever having a racist genocide ever again, to ever have a situation where we're fighting against the Neanderthals. Arguably, that part was okay, but then going around and killing all the dwarves and all the other groups that had nothing to do with it, and innocent people that we just destroyed. And you've got places like Easter Island, which seems to have been set up by people that knew they were going to be killed. So a pygmy group that were there that created that as a last hope and said, "Please remember us," sort of thing. And yeah, so there's a lot of a lot of things that we did that we shouldn't have done. Um, and yeah, there's a lot of things there. I mean, the pyramids, I think, tie into this. I believe there were originally lots of pyramids, and pyramids were aimed to be not just electricity. They were mobile electricity, which we had at the time. Like I'm talking 100,000 years ago, but they were also meant to survive the kind of war that the Neanderthals would bring, so that when the Neanderthals were attacking us, we would still have electricity. And mobile electricity is simpler than the kind of electricity we have now. Mobile electricity, I mean, Nikola Tesla invented that, and then our normal electricity was based on that, but it's a safer version. Um, so yeah, mobile electricity, you would have been able to zap people through your fingers, and you would have been able to fly, and it would have been very dangerous, but also very powerful. And I think ancient technologies, ancient societies, and I'm not talking 2,000 years, I'm talking much older than that. I'm talking 20, 50, 100,000 years ago, had that. And it's not, it's such a simple thing to make. It's much simpler than our grounded technology and all this complicated stuff we got now. But it would have been dangerous. So I think that they had that the pyramids were aimed to be defensive war things that were aimed to keep the electricity going so that we could power our electric powered weapons to stop the Neanderthals from attacking. And I think that the Denisovans, however tall they were probably helping to build those pyramids, so they were giants. And also, I think that mobile electricity itself helped to build the pyramids. So you had smaller pyramids that were set up first, and then they were used to make the mobile electricity to help us to build the big ones. And I think they had them all around the world, but um, certainly in the power bases of the world. Perhaps not every country, because not every country was relevant. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that Australia wasn't participating in those sort of wars, and nor would America. Um, Either North or South America, they had nothing to do with this. This was always sort of Africa, Europe, and a bit of Asia. They were the power areas. And by the looks of it, certainly most of us of the world's history, Africa was the power base. But that's perhaps North Africa or Central Africa, sort of North Central Africa. That would have been the power base around Iraq, maybe Chad and Ethiopia, and that would have been the power base for the world. That would have been where the most powerful um, parts were. Um, Europe would have been reasonably powerful, particularly Southern Europe, but yeah, and I mean China's been powerful for a long time. Um, so yeah, there's all this sort of stuff, and I think like when we look at, and a lot of people say orcs, of course they're not real. I think orcs were real beings. They were just a type of human, and we've just denigrated them and made them look bad. And then we say orcs are mythological. I think orcs was one of the three names we gave to Neanderthals. Well, not only three, so we had orcs, trolls, and goblins for different sizes of Neanderthals, perhaps different types of Neanderthals. And we also had, of course, the more civilized names such as Adamu and what they call themselves, which were Aryans, and what we call them historically, which is Neanderthals. Definitely didn't call them Neanderthals at the time. So that's six names for the same people. So just to be clear, Neanderthal is what we call them today. Definitely weren't called that at the time. Adamu is what a civilized name for them, the proper name for them was at the time, many red-headed ones. Aryans is what they call themselves, and that's not to say that Indians are all Neanderthals, although Indians definitely have Neanderthal DNA, but that's just the physical location of it and the name. And then we have goblins, which are the shorter version, orcs, which are the average size, and trolls, which were the giant size. And then giants were separate. Giants were Denisovans. Dwarves were the various pygmy races. There's more than one type of dwarf. Now, and of course, elves and fairies were never meant to be real. They were metaphysical, basically angels. And as for dragons, I think the jury's out as to whether they were ever real. So they could have been gods. That's our word for God. It's dragon. Or they could have been, and therefore not a real being. Or they could have been us just confusing dinosaur bones. I don't think that's very likely. Or they could have been actual dinosaurs living at the same time as us. Not that it was recent, but 100,000 years ago, they could have been still some dinosaurs going around. And the other thing is, what's the thing? Humans and pre-humans, I mean, we all started with one species, 5 billion years ago, or 4.5 billion years ago. So we definitely were around at the same time as dinosaurs from that perspective. We weren't humans then, but our ancestors were around because our ancestors were around when life first was around. In fact, we were dinosaurs. Well, okay, we don't come from them. We come from the same species, the same little single-celled organisms that created dinosaurs, that created us, different parts. So there certainly would have been one of our ancestors that was around at the same time as dinosaurs. So we should have a genetic memory of that. So anyone saying that we weren't around at the same time as dinosaurs, I wasn't. In fact, humans that look like this. When white skin's only been around for about 8, 10,000 years, maybe 12. Even if you go hominids, no, and they weren't. But then you got the definition. What is a dinosaur? Is a crocodile a type of dinosaur? So it does get a bit confusing. Now, then you get, of course, vampires. I say, well, vampires were just, well, some people say they were owls. So when you talk about a vampire, you're talking about an owl. That's what it was in Sumerian beliefs. But, or Lilith at least. So Lilith was the first vampire. Got into that. But from a spiritual perspective, vampires were what happened when you commit suicide. If you commit suicide, you become a vampire. There's certain protections against it, but and it was mostly a female thing. So women, if you're a woman, I suppose most people that commit suicide would. No, that's not true. Most men. But anyway, it was always considered to be a woman, and the man would be seduced by a female vampire, and then he'd become a vampire, but he was a lesser vampire. So most vampires were female. Now, obviously, that's a myth. It's never the only physical basis of that are owls, which fair bit off. Um, so another one that's mythological. So werewolves were, of course, they were from native religions, particularly in North America, and essentially that's an ascended being from a that that followed a particular animal. It wasn't just werewolf; it could be werebear, were whatever. And if you reached a certain level of enlightenment, you became a werewolf or whatever. Again, that's mythological. There's no physical evidence of that, but they were good. They were like perhaps not angels, but sort of avatars, sort of demigods, and they were good. They were considered good people. So werewolves were good, vampires were evil, and they're from two different religions, and they were mythological. So they're not. There's no real physical basis for that other than a little owls thing, and maybe werewolves could fit a bit. Zombies are from voodoo, also hoodoo, which is similar to voodoo. That was somebody who was drugged and forced to become an assassin, usually to kill somebody else, and they'd usually be killed after they committed the murder. Therefore, oh, you're undead, but you weren't really dead in the first place. They were just drugged and forced to manipulate. And that, that's, it's obvious that they were real. So zombies were real, but they're not as depicted in the movies nowadays. It's more like if you look at old movies, so before 1980, and you look at how zombies were depicted there, that's they're real. But we've moved away from that and we've made a fictionalized version of zombies which is not based on reality. So zombies were real, they were not mythological. Unicorn's another one that's interesting because there were unicorns, that's just a one-horned rhinoceros. They were never depicted in medieval scrolls as being anything like the white horse with nothing like that. So yeah, one-horned rhinoceroses were real, and they coexisted with humans. One type was a Siberian rhinoceros, definitely existed with humans. They died out, I think, 120,000 years ago. So, you know, in terms of the history of humanity, that's not that long ago, and we definitely existed with them. They would have been unusual, hard to find, and we consider them spectacular and amazing. Not really narwhals. I know narwhals have a single horn, but no, rhinoceros for sure. Um, Yeah, so definitely unicorns are real but extinct. Definitely zombies were real, but illegal. You could make a zombie now, and I'm sure CIA and stuff still do it, but it's illegal. It's quite evil. But yeah, so orcs are real, extinct. But I suppose most people in the world have Neanderthal DNA in them, and you could say, well, you have orc DNA. You're part orc, but not much at all. So the big question then is how did we ever defeat the Neanderthals? I know I've said fairly confident that the giants or the Denisovans helped, and then we had the natural disasters, whether it's called the Great Flood, the meteors, the volcanoes, all that sort of stuff. But we would have needed a bit of luck too. I mean, would have had more numbers than them, but somehow we got it together and we won that war. And then we hit it. I reckon we won that war. We would have been really proud of winning that war. Then we went around the world and killed all the pygmies. Pretty unfair. They had nothing to do with it. Killed the dwarves. And then we felt so bad about killing all of them who were completely innocent that we hid all of our glorious achievements in defeating the Neanderthals. So that today we have not really much of an idea how we did it. I know some people say, oh, Neanderthals were stupid. They were not stupid. Oh, well, they were smart, but then they stagnated. No, not at all. We just defeated them. How did we defeat them? Do we have strength in numbers? Were the pyramids so great? I don't think the pyramids were ever anything more than just mobile power plants. Um, Nothing particularly amazing about them. They just showed that our technology was better than we pretend it was. How did we defeat them? I mean, we certainly defeated them before the cataclysm. We defeated them about 30,000 years ago. So we had about 70,000 years of war, maybe longer, maybe 100,000 years of war. 30,000 years ago, we won. And yeah, there were remnants later. Um, but yeah, we won. So somehow we won. How did we win? I mean, was it the giants? Was there one big battle? The giants sacrificed themselves, all died, and then there was few enough, or small enough numbers of Neanderthals that we could clean it up. Something like that seems the most likely, but it is a bit of a mystery. And somehow we beat them, and then they hit off into Atlantis. We didn't know that that's what they're doing, but they went to Atlantis and masqueraded as gods. So we started worshipping them as gods. What is now Mauritania. We know that. We know that's what they did. And went there and pretended to be gods, maybe even pretended to be the Egyptian gods as well, as remnants. And then we got rid of them too. So it's a it's a funny thing that we still don't know how we managed to do it. Maybe it was just that the Neanderthals made a bad decision. Maybe they were busy fighting amongst each other right when we attacked. Maybe they just wiped each other out so small and then we attacked with the giants and it was just enough. But if you had it and you go back in history and look at it, I'd say most of the time you'd expect us to have lost that war. We should have lost. We should just be Neanderthals now. And maybe a few human or Homo sapien remnants just running around. And I think it's an interesting mystery because this is one of the great mysteries that we do not know the answer to. I know the answer to all the little bits and I've got fairly good guesses, but that one, how we won that war, is a mystery because we shouldn't have won. We should not have won that war. Any way you look at it, even if you say, like, let's say, and we take the Sumerian view that they say the world was overpopulated. Let's say that we had 40 billion humans in the world. And let's say there were 40 billion of us and there was only 5 billion Neanderthals. And let's say there was 1 billion giants or Denisovans, around about that number. Now, no, some people say, well, there was only 20,000. I'm sorry, there were more people around before the last cataclysm, more people around than there is now. I could get into that, but there were. But let's say we don't know how many Neanderthals there were compared to us, but it seems like there were a lot less of them than there were of us. So let's say there was 40 billion compared to 5 billion of them, and there was only 1 billion giants. We know there weren't that many giants. So let's say that they're the numbers. I don't know if that is the right number, but let's say that they were. You still think they should have won. The giants wouldn't have been, yeah, they're bigger, but giants wouldn't have been able to beat Neanderthals one on one, let alone 1 to 5 with the Neanderthals having the majority. They wouldn't have been able to win. Even if you've got 40 billion humans, 1 billion giants against 5 billion orcs, the orcs are still going to win. You're going to win. And you'd have to have something else. You have to have a distraction. Maybe the orcs are fighting each other just beforehand and they're mid-fight, mid-civil war, maybe 2 or 3 factions. Maybe we ally with one of their factions, we sneak around and then boom. Maybe we took one side of the orcs and our 40 billion supported them, or 1 billion of us maybe. Maybe some of the giants took the other side and pretending to fight against each other. Maybe the orcs thought, oh, it's giants against humans, ha ha ha, they're going to wipe each other out. And then We actually wiped them out. Something happened, caused us to win. That is an absolute mystery. I don't think the pyramids resolves that issue. I'm sorry. Um, it's something that, and then we have hidden it. Whatever we did, we have hidden it, which suggests that we did something a bit nasty. And I'd say the whole genocide of all the pygmies, all the dwarves, suggests that whatever we did was pretty evil. Maybe we created some sort of virus that targets Neanderthals and only Neanderthals, but then that would risk us. Maybe it did kill all of us. Maybe it killed 5 billion of them and killed 5 billion of us as well. And but we were prepared to take that because we had bigger numbers. Maybe that's what we did. Maybe we were prepared to lose 10 billion of us even, and maybe the whole of North Africa, all the humans in there, all got wiped out in order to take out the Neanderthals, and we only had the people living in sub-Saharan Africa, and that's it, because everybody else got wiped out by this virus. Maybe it wasn't a virus. Maybe it was a genetically created insect or something else. But whatever it was, we won. We won. I'd say the evidence suggests we did something completely evil to win, but we won. And I think it'd be great to find out what it was, how we won. And I think if we dug up the Richat structure in Mauritania, we'd probably have some clue. And I'm going to suggest that there are people that already know, but they won't tell us because they don't want us to know. And they don't want us to know that we're not the most powerful creature that's ever been. And they don't want us to know that we had to do something completely evil to beat the Neanderthals because it doesn't look like we should have won. So we had to have done something so disgusting that we had to hide it later and create two new religions based on the Neanderthal religion in two different directions just to hide it. And the Sumerian religion was definitely not the first religion that humans had. I mean, fairies were before that. We went from the fairy religion to the Sumerian religion to abandoning all that and having two different versions of the Neanderthal religion because what we did to them was so evil that we have to go back to them and wish that we were them. It's almost like we're saying we wish that they were the ones that survived because they were the good guys, we were the bad guys, and we don't want to be the bad guys anymore. So what did we do? What did we do to defeat the Neanderthals? Had to have been something awful, something, some virus, some unleash of evil that almost wiped us out too, most likely. Something. Maybe I'll figure it out one day, but it had to have been something really revolting. Yeah, that's it for me. Bye bye now.